When I refused to hand over my savings to finance his business, my father called a lawyer and declared, "I'm suing you for emotional abandonment, Mary." The court papers arrived, but on the day of the trial, I walked in with a surprise witness that left the judge speechless and my father screaming with rage. My name is Fabio Mendez, and I've always been the black sheep of the family for one reason. I refuse to throw my money down the drain. While others see an insensitive and selfish son, I only see a survivor who learned the most important lesson of my childhood. Nobody will come to rescue you, especially not your own family. My father, Roberto Mendez, considers himself a born entrepreneur. The reality is quite different. In the last 20 years he has started 4 businesses, all with the same cycle. Initial enthusiasm, family investment, premature expansion, debts, excuses, and finally bankruptcy. First it was the appliance store that lasted 2 years. Then came the fusion food restaurant, which closed in less than 8 months. After that, he tried a specialized travel agency just before the pandemic, and his last failure was an organic product distributor that never delivered a single order. These are investments, Fabio, not failures. Edison failed thousands of times before inventing the light bulb. He repeated every time I reminded him of the money I had lent him to pay the rent after each business disaster. Unlike my siblings, Carlos and Lucia, I had to start working at 16, handing out flyers on weekends to buy clothes and cover my school expenses. By the time I turned 18, I was juggling 2 part-time jobs while studying accounting at the public university. It wasn't by choice but by necessity. My father considered fostering independence his form of parenting, while for my younger siblings, he always found money for whims and luxuries. "You are the strong one, the responsible one," he would say when I complained about the unequal treatment. "They need me more than you." It was during those years that I developed a steel-like financial discipline. Every peso earned was recorded, every expense planned, every saving protected as if it were a treasure. It wasn't stinginess, it was survival, and it worked. At 30, I had achieved what seemed impossible in my family: financial stability, a small apartment of my own, and an emergency fund that would allow me to survive 6 months without income. It was precisely that fund that unleashed the storm that would forever change our family dynamic. It all started with a call from my father, brimming with enthusiasm, as always when he had a new golden opportunity. "Fabio, I've found the ultimate business. A friend has offered me to be the exclusive distributor of a line of revolutionary nutritional supplements. It's practically guaranteed money." His voice vibrated with that familiar excitement that preceded every financial disaster. I already knew where the conversation was going before the inevitable question arrived. "I just need a small initial boost, about $30,000, to secure the territory and the initial inventory. We'll get it back in 3 months for at the most. This time it's different, I promise." When I explained for the umpteenth time that I would not invest in his schemes, his tone instantly changed from enthusiasm to wounded disappointment, his usual tactic. "After everything I've done for you, you know I've never asked you for anything. Lie. Your mother would be so disappointed to see what you've become." Low blow. Considering that Mom had abandoned us 15 years ago, tired of the debts and empty promises, what followed was the usual deployment of the family's heavy artillery. First came the messages from Lucia. "Dad is devastated. How can you be so selfish?" Then Carlos's calls. "This is the last time he's asking you for help. Are you really going to deny him this opportunity?" Even my Aunt Marta joined in the pressure. "Family comes first, Fabio, always." What I never expected was the last call from my father 2 weeks later, with an unusually calm and calculating tone. "I've consulted with a lawyer, Fabio. He explained to me that there are laws about emotional abandonment and the obligation of children towards their parents. If you don't help me voluntarily, we'll have to resort to other methods. I hope you reconsider before this becomes legal." I laughed. I literally laughed on the phone. "Dad, that's ridiculous. You can't sue someone for not giving you money for another one of your failed businesses." "We'll see, son, we'll see." I hung up thinking it was another one of his manipulation tactics. A week later, the postman delivered an envelope with official papers from the municipal court. I wasn't laughing now. The envelope I held in my hand seemed to weigh a ton. Court summons. Mendez versus Mendez. Lawsuit for family support. My first reaction was absolute disbelief. The document alleged that my father, being in a situation of economic vulnerability and unable to generate sufficient income due to his advanced age, requested the court to compel me to provide him with filial alimony based on statutes for the protection of older adults. What made this case particularly twisted was how his lawyer had manipulated the facts. He presented my father as a helpless 65-year-old man. Although he was perfectly healthy and active, he completely omitted to mention that the money was for a business and falsely suggested that I had benefited financially from his upbringing and now refused to reciprocate the care received. The most absurd thing was the amount requested: $5,000 as a one-time payment for past support, plus a continuous monthly pension. The next day, I met with Elena Vasquez, a lawyer specializing in family law, recommended by a friend. After reviewing the documents, her expression oscillated between professional disbelief and personal indignation. "This is a case of procedural abuse," she commented, adjusting her glasses. "They have misrepresented the purpose of family support laws. These laws exist for genuine cases where elderly parents cannot meet their basic needs, not to finance ventures. Does he have any chance of success?" I asked worriedly. "Honestly, it's a frivolous lawsuit, but his lawyer, this German Soto, is known for presenting cases on the border of ethical. He has included enough half-truths for a judge to at least agree to review the case." Her gaze became penetrating. "What worries me is how this will affect your family." She was right to be worried. Within days, the case leaked through friends and acquaintances. Living in a medium-sized city has its disadvantages. Gossip travels faster than the truth. Soon, the dominant narrative in our community was that I, the heartless son with money, refused to help my poor widowed father in his hour of need. The pressure was suffocating. I stopped answering calls from relatives. I blocked several cousins on social media after reading their accusatory comments. Even my boss called me into his office to ask me, with false concern, if my personal problems would affect my performance. The nights became torment. I slept in intervals, waking up drenched in cold sweat. During the day, anxiety accompanied me like a shadow, making me question every decision I had made. Was I really the villain of this story? Was I being selfish by protecting my financial stability? The guilt sown during years of manipulation now flourished in my mind like a poisonous plant. "What we might need," suggested Elena at our second meeting, "is to document the financial history between you and your father. Any previous loans, any relevant pattern of behavior." That suggestion was the catalyst I needed. I began methodically compiling every financial interaction with my father. Bank transfers, text messages asking for money, even receipts from the times I had paid his utility bills when they threatened to cut them off. It was a painfully detailed record of a one-way relationship, but it wasn't enough. I needed more, something that would show that this wasn't an isolated case but a pattern of behavior. I began to investigate his previous businesses, contacting former employees and partners. Most avoided me, some hung up on me, but a few were willing to talk. It was during one of these conversations that I first heard the name Marcos Ibarra. "Marcos Ibarra? Of course I remember him," said Joaquin, a former employee of my father's restaurant. "He was the main supplier. He invested a lot of money in the business. Your father promised him a partnership, but when the restaurant started having problems, he disappeared with what was left in the cash register. Ibarra was left financially and emotionally devastated. It took me 3 days to locate Marcos. When we finally met at a discreet coffee shop far from my neighborhood, I was surprised to find myself with an older man of about 60, with kind but deeply sad eyes. "Your father is very convincing," he told me after hearing my story. "He has that gift. He makes you believe not only in his ideas, but also that you are special for being a part of them." He paused to take a sip of his coffee. "I lost my retirement savings in that restaurant, $200,000 that I had accumulated throughout my working life." My stomach tightened upon hearing the figure. "I'm so sorry. It wasn't just the money," Marcos continued. "Your father forged my signature on several documents, taking on debts in my name. It took me 3 years to clear my credit history. Do you have proof of this?" I asked, feeling a mixture of shame and hope. Marcos looked at me for a long time before answering. "I have more than proof. I have documentation of at least 5 more people he scammed in a similar way, including this new nutritional supplement business. What? How is that possible? Because he already tried this same scheme 2 years ago in another city. He convinced a brother-in-law to invest. The products never existed. The parent company was a front. It's a basic Ponzi scheme. Use the money from new investors to pay small returns to the previous ones until you disappear with the bulk of the capital. My mind reeled as Marcos pulled a thick folder from his briefcase. I've kept this for years, waiting for the day your father would try to get back in the game. Maybe it's time to use it. Reviewing the documents, the magnitude of the deception left me breathless. Not only was there evidence of previous scams, but also recent emails where my father was negotiating with the alleged supplement suppliers, a phantom company registered in the name of a distant cousin. Would you be willing to testify? I finally asked. Marcos smiled for the first time. Son, I've waited 5 years for this opportunity. Back home, while organizing the evidence with Elena, I faced the biggest moral dilemma of my life. Publicly exposing my father would not only ruin his reputation, but could lead him to face criminal charges. Despite everything, he was still my father. We can use this to force a settlement, suggested Elena, sensitive to my internal conflict. It wouldn't be necessary to present it in court. I was considering that option when my phone vibrated with a message from Lucia. I hope you're satisfied. Dad is devastated. He barely eats. If something happens to him before the trial, it will be completely your fault. Attached was a photo of my father, apparently dejected, in an armchair with a calculatedly desolate expression. Something broke inside me at that moment. Decades of manipulation crystallized into a perfect and painful clarity. This wasn't family love. It was systematic emotional and financial abuse, and I would not be his next victim. Prepare all the documents, I told Elena with a determination I didn't know I possessed. We will present them at trial. The appointed day was approaching, and with it, the confrontation that would change our family forever. The day of the trial dawned with a leaden sky that perfectly reflected my mood. I adjusted my tie in front of the mirror, surprised by the deep dark circles that framed my eyes. 3 weeks of anxiety had left their mark. Remember, we'll keep a low profile until the right moment, Elena reminded me as we headed to the courtroom. Let them present their full case before we show our cards. The family court was an old building with high ceilings and a solemn air that intensified my nervousness. Upon entering the room, I saw my father sitting next to his lawyer, German Soto, a thin man in an expensive suit and a confident smile. Behind them were Lucia and Carlos, looking at me as if I had committed treason. In the last row, I distinguished several relatives and friends of my father, all with the same expression of disapproval. Your witness is ready in the waiting room, Elena whispered, squeezing my arm slightly to give me confidence. The proceedings began with the usual formalities. Judge Ramirez, a man of about 50 with a penetrating gaze and precise gestures, briefly reviewed the documents before inviting my father's lawyer to present his case. Soto rose with studied theatricality. Your Honor, we are facing a painful but necessary case. Roberto Mendez, after decades dedicated to raising and supporting his son, now finds himself in a situation of economic vulnerability, while his son enjoys financial stability. The law and morality are clear. There is an obligation of children towards their parents when they are in need. For the next 20 minutes, Soto painted a distorted but convincing picture. A selfless father who sacrificed professional opportunities to raise his children alone after his wife abandoned him. An honest entrepreneur with bad luck. An older man who simply asked his financially stable son for a chance to recover. The only thing Mr. Mendez is asking for is a fair pension and initial support so that he can regain his economic independence, Soto concluded. It is not charity he asks for, but the fulfillment of a moral and legal obligation. My father was called to testify and played his role perfectly. In a broken voice, he described how he had sacrificed everything for his children, especially for me. He spoke of sleepless nights working to give me the best, of the enormous expenses of my education, and how now in his hour of need I turned my back on him. I just want a chance to fend for myself, he said with perfectly calculated tearful eyes. At my age, I need this boost so as not to be a burden to anyone in the future. When our turn came, Elena kept her promise of a direct and undramatic approach. Your Honor, we recognize the family bond and the moral obligations that exist between parents and children. However, this case is not about family support, but about an attempt to obtain financing for a business under false pretenses. We presented documentation of my self-sufficiency since the age of 16, records of previous loans never repaid, and written testimonies from distant relatives that confirmed the true family dynamic. Judge Ramirez listened attentively, occasionally asking incisive questions to both parties. When it seemed that we had finished our arguments, Elena uttered the words that would change the course of the case. Your Honor, we would like to call an additional witness who can shed light on the true intentions behind this lawsuit, Mr. Marcos Ibarra. My father's face instantly transformed. Confidence gave way to panic, a change so evident that even the judge noticed it. Marcos entered with a firm step, carrying a thick folder. After being sworn in, he began his testimony in a calm but firm voice. I met Roberto Mendez 6 years ago when he convinced me to invest my retirement savings in what he called the most promising restaurant in the city. He assured me impossible returns and showed me financial projections that I now know were completely fabricated. For the next 15 minutes, Marcos presented meticulous documentation, manipulated contracts, forged signatures, bank statements showing how the money had been diverted to personal accounts, and most devastatingly, proof that the current supplement business was identical to a scam my father had attempted 2 years earlier. This is not an isolated case, Marcos continued as the silence in the room became oppressive. I have documented at least 7 similar cases in the last 10 years, including relatives and close friends of Mr. Mendez. The final revelation was especially devastating. Recent emails where my father discussed with his cousin how they would use the investment money to settle personal debts and finance a trip to Europe. In my professional opinion as a former bank auditor, Marcos concluded, this constitutes a systematic pattern of financial fraud. The silence in the room was absolute. I saw Lucia covering her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with shock. Carlos looked at the floor, unable to face the exposed truth. My father seemed to have aged 10 years in those minutes, all pretense abandoned. His lawyer tried to discredit Marcos with aggressive questions about his personal vendetta, but each attack was countered with more irrefutable documentation. When all the presentations were concluded, Judge Ramirez took barely 5 minutes to deliberate. This court finds that the lawsuit filed by Roberto Mendez constitutes an abuse of the judicial system. It is not only completely dismissed, but I order that the plaintiff cover all legal expenses of the defendant. His gaze hardened as he addressed my father. Mr. Mendez, I strongly suggest that you be grateful that your son has chosen to defend himself in the civil sphere instead of filing criminal charges for the facts exposed today. The final gavel blow resonated in the room like thunder, marking the end of decades of manipulation. In the hallway, I saw my father being confronted by relatives who had previously condemned me. Lucia cried, torn between disbelief and shame. Carlos approached me with a defeated expression. I had no idea, Fabio. I really didn't know. I know, I simply replied. There was no satisfaction in his pain, only the relief that the truth had finally come to light. In the following weeks, the consequences unfolded like ripples in a pond. My father, desperate after losing not only the trial but also his support network, tried to contact his other children to ask them for money. For the first time, he met with unanimous refusals. I established an educational trust for my nephews with explicit clauses preventing my father from accessing those funds. It was my way of ensuring that the cycle of financial dependence did not affect the next generation. I obtained a restraining order that legally prohibited my father from contacting me for financial matters, a formal barrier that finally gave me the peace of mind I needed to heal. The most surprising thing was how slowly some relatives began to approach me for financial advice, tacitly acknowledging that my approach had been correct all along. Sometimes you build your real family after understanding who was never really part of it, I commented to Elena during our last meeting. It wasn't revenge that gave me peace, but the liberation from a toxic cycle that had dominated my life for too long. Justice, when it finally arrived, didn't feel like a triumph, but like the first day of the rest of my life. The bravest act we can perform is not handing over our resources to maintain a false family peace, but setting firm boundaries that break toxic cycles. True responsibility towards our family does not consist in allowing destructive behaviors, but in having the courage to confront them, even when that means being alone temporarily. In the end, the truth always finds its way to the light, and it is at that moment that we discover who truly belongs in our family.